Imagine a skyline dotted with high-rise, each a testament to architectural ambition and economic growth. What happens when these towering structures, built around the same time, begin to show their age? I'm Susanna Noureddine, Head of Facade Engineering at WSP in the Middle East. And this episode of the Anticipate podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Andy Dean, not just colleague, friend, and one of our senior technical directors for asset transformation at WSP. And in today's episode, we will explore how facades age and the potential risk of neglecting their maintenance. More importantly, we will also discuss strategic planning and preparation for refurbishing these buildings. With a wave of high-rise expected to age simultaneously, the challenge is immense. But so are the opportunities for innovation and improvement. So Andy, thank you for joining me today and welcome to the Anticipate podcast. I'm very delighted, very happy and very honored to have the pleasure in interviewing you. Yeah, welcome.
Thanks, Susanna. It's great for you to invite me onto it. It's a really good opportunity for me because there's a really serious message that I want to try and get out to the region, the GCC in particular. I think that it's an incredibly important message. I think that if we don't get what we need to do done in the next 10 to 20 years, I think we could have some really big societal problems in the GCC, which would be an incredible shame based on all the work we've been doing for the last 20 to 30 years.
Okay, great. So I'm pretty much looking forward to our discussion and to get our audience on board and to address the issue to someone who does not know anything about facades and who is new to the GCC. What do you think is the crux to the issue we have?
Well, I think there's probably a bit of scene setting to do there. And if you'll indulge me a minute, my prediction is that existing asset projects will replace new build projects through the next 20 years and will become the dominant market. So that's just a little bit of scene setting. And look, there's an inevitability to aging. What we built in the 90s and the noughties, and since then it's all aging, just like everybody, us. And so there's nothing we can do about that. Also, globally, there's been obviously an incredible awareness now and sign-on to the COP Accords. And, we've hosted in the UAE, for example, just one of the GCC countries, we've hosted the COP28 and the GCC nations have signed on to that. Also, there's a maturing stakeholdership as well. There's, a lot of very senior people here have now been away to university, grown up through the management and in top management. There's an ownership level in the region, which is very much aware now and has an international perspective on these things. And like I said, if we don't get this right now, if we don't address the issues that I'm about to explain on this podcast, I'm really worried that there'll be issues through the GCC on a societal level.
Thanks for that introduction. But before we go into the details, would you give us a little bit of a background of who you are? I mean, I have known you now for, I think, 8 years, nearly. Or at least I know that your name is floated in the market, especially here in the Middle East. I think you have been one of the leaders in shaping the facade industry in the Middle East. So yeah, please give us a little bit of a background in your career history and who you are.
Thanks, Susanna. Yeah, I'm known to a lot of people. Hopefully that's a good thing. Well, I think the reason for that is I've had some great opportunities. I got to the Middle East in the mid-90s, so approaching 30 years ago. And I set up, on behalf of the company that I used to work for, I set up a facade testing facility, facade testing. So we tested weather tightness of facades, so air infiltration, water penetration, thermal effects. So we're really measuring how facades work. Also the same for fire performance, also the same for acoustic performance. And then about 10 years ago, I moved from the testing and certification space into the design space, into the consultancy space. And I've been really lucky, because I was in Dubai relatively early, I've been really lucky to get the opportunity to contribute to code development. I've had the opportunity to be given some great platforms on which to speak about things that I was concerned about many years ago, like ACP and fire performance, acoustic performance, and how glass and facades can affect people's health in things like hospitals and schools and productivity in offices and things like that. So I think I've just had a great opportunity over the last 30 years to to use the various platforms and the various great platforms that we have in Dubai to send out some messages. But over the last couple of years, I've turned my attention to facade refurbishments in particular. I've always been involved in failure investigations. Any laboratory does that. You often get involved as a third party. So failure investigations are in my genes, if you like. They're in my genetics. They're part of kind of my history. But refurbishments arguably is kind of a similar thought process. You're taking something that was built, that was performing, maybe isn't performing the way it should have been performing, and now either needs to be brought back to performance or hopefully performance enhanced and brought up to current levels of expectations. So it goes, what I do now, what I've recently transitioned to, goes hand in hand with that history, if you like. And because I've got that unique kind of that history and the length of history here, it's just a great opportunity. And in doing that, though, a couple of things have occurred to me that I think that a lot of people are missing. And so this is a great opportunity now to kind of get that information out there.
Okay. So over the past 30 years, right, you being in the Middle East and especially during your design stage of your career, what do you think would be the problem if we don't start refurbishing facades? And what do you think we as facade designers should consider during the design process to make it easier and or longer lasting?
Well, look, there's three main things, really. You get a drop in energy performance. That's one of the things. So as things age, performance drops. So if you're talking about a facade, you're talking about thermal performance. So our ability to keep the sun out, our ability to keep the heat out in the GCC context, of course, different in other parts of the world, that decreases. Also, and really importantly for the GCC, you get air infiltration issues. I'll explain a little bit later, if you give me the opportunity, that gaskets and sealants and things like that are very much an issue for that. But air infiltration is a huge problem for the Middle East. But you also get water penetration. People will say that we don't get a lot of rain here. We don't, but we do wash our buildings a lot because they get a lot of sand on the outside of them. And also we get condensation as well. So again, we do have water to deal with. And when you get a drop in performance, you get cost increases and also potential damage that can become a more serious issue. The second thing is aesthetics. It's not the least of our issues, but it is an important issue. You get coatings that corrode and start to flake off. Glass starts to become cloudy as the double glazing units, the seal on the double glazing units fail. I'm sure you've seen that yourself, Susanna. And it is unfortunately inevitable. It's not something that won't happen if you leave a facade long enough. But generally, facades, which are essentially the clothes of the skin of the building, which is incredibly important. It's the first thing you interact with when you come up to a building. You see the facade, it starts to look old and untidy. And why that's so important is because revenue then starts to decrease. If you're renting out your building, or you've got people who are in the building, they just move on to the next building because we are building a lot new all the time here. So and as revenue decreases, you get less maintenance, etc., and it becomes actually a far-reaching problem. But probably most importantly, you start to get safety issues. So because of the air infiltration, you start to get mold. So you get condensation first, and that condensation creates a great opportunity for mold. And so you get mold patches appearing and kind of marks around the facade. You actually get corrosion of the structure as well as that gets further advanced. I've seen on, frankly, multiple occasions, glass actually falling out of building. I don't want to be alarmist here, but it does happen, and it has happened. And it is a function of an aging facade, usually. But also, and this is, again, a crux that I'll come on to later, you get a loss of protection. So the job of the facade is to keep the outside out and the inside in, be that keeping people out or in, be that keeping, weather out or in. And once you lose your performance of your facade, you lose that protection. Obviously, then risk and liability increases, and we don't want that to happen. So essentially, that's what happens if we don't refurbish a facade.
I think with the recent weather changes in the region, especially in Dubai, cloud seeding, the heavy storms we have, the endless high rises, and a lot of more people moving or migrating into Dubai, the quality of apartments, I think probably everyone can relate in what it means to get like water in. When you leave the house without like putting on the air conditioning for a couple of weeks, you come back and there's like mold issues that we all, I think, experience that on a daily basis, and but we cannot relate where it's actually coming from and what's the bigger issue behind it. No, so probably a design issue and then like a maintenance issue. With all that, what you have explained about what happens if we don't refurbish them or maintaining the facade properly, what would be the first indicator of where you would say this is like an aging facade, and how do facades age within your experience?
Yeah, well, I should also say that, because you mentioned it there, Susanna, that because you mentioned HVAC systems, essentially, when you come back from your you come back home and you kind of, things are a little bit humid when you get in and all of those kind of things. Of course, when the facade stops performing, it actually puts pressure on other systems in the building. They start having to work harder. And remember, they'll be probably of a similar age to the facade at that stage. So everything starts to get more challenged in the first place. But to answer your questions about how facades age, well, ultimately, it really depends on the material. And in that respect, it's a really salient and important part of the issue that we have. So you've got aluminium, obviously, and steel and metal, but aluminium's doesn't corrode particularly quickly, generally, on a facade. Don't get me wrong, I've seen plenty of issues where if it's in a particularly bad situation, it corrodes very quickly. I was looking at a building the other day, and the base of the facade had got covered in sand. Literally, sand had started to build up against the facade. And when it was cleaned away, the aluminium was actually gone. We've got a highly corrosive environment in the GCC. We have a lot of humidity. We have a lot of salt in the air. It's a coastal environment. There is a good deal of pollution here. It's a city and a lot of heat. So, aluminium, if you put it in a worse environment, which is bury it, it'll be completely gone. But generally on a facade, on the most of the facade, it won't be a problem. But you might get coatings that start to peel off. So again, the aluminium isn't a huge issue. Certainly not in the kind of first couple of decades. You've got ferrous metals in there, though, as well. Typically, we use aluminium for our framing systems, but we use ferrous metals, so steels and stainless steels for our fixings. And we don't really want to be having those in an environment where you have an electrolyte, so condensation or water. But again, that's not typically one of the biggest issues, because even that wouldn't be the first to go under most circumstances. The big problem that we have in the Middle East, and I want to focus on the GCC in particular, because the GCC is where the biggest issue is for what we want to say today. It's polymers. Polymers, I'm talking about sealants, be that silicon or polysulfides or polyurethanes, talking about gaskets. And again, typically they might either be silicon or EPDMs, and plastics. Plastics may be things that we use as spacers or other elements within the facade, polyamides, for example. When they are subject to UV and heat and solutions and pollutants and salts, they harden and they crack. Essentially, we have these elements, particularly the sealants and gaskets, we have these elements in our facade for flexibility. Usually they're providing a membrane that's for expansion, or they're providing a gasket in between, say, glass and aluminium that has to retain water tightness or air tightness, or they're creating the air barrier. Well, as all buildings move, constantly on a daily basis, particularly, in a high solar environment, they're moving in and out on a daily basis, they have to retain their flexibility. As soon as they start to harden and crack, you lose the thermal break of, say, for example, of a gasket. So your gasket starts to conduct more heat. But more importantly, it doesn't open and close like it used to. So it lets air in, it lets water in. And let's make no mistake about this here. Our biggest problem, and again, a lot of people don't realize this, so kind of spell it out. Our biggest problem in the GCC in particular, particularly the coastal regions, is air infiltration. We have, particularly in the summertime, an inexhaustible supply of hot, humid air. it might be 35, 34, 35 degrees in the daytime. That doesn't feel very humid, but it is when it's 45 degrees C. And when, the temperature drops in the evening, as we've all felt here, that races quickly to 80, 90%. Well, if you've got hot, humid air coming in constantly, 24 hours a day, that humidity, as soon as it touches a colder surface, will condense. And that condensation has to be managed. Now, if you manage a facade properly, yes, the condensation moves outwards. But if facade if the gaskets of the facade start to fail, and then you start to let air into areas where it shouldn't be, well, then you start to get condensation that flows inwards instead of outwards. So you might see air infiltration on the back of plasterboard or on furniture. During COVID, many of the hotels were mothballed and the rooms were closed, and so they weren't ventilated. Sometimes ACs were turned off. And in a lot of cases, people either came back to, or hotels came back to, apartments which were full of mold in wardrobes, on clothes. And it's a very real problem. I spend most of my working week these days working on buildings, obviously the existing buildings and existing assets. And one of the most common complaints right now is mold in the first place, because that's what you see, and then finding condensation and looking at how we improve that situation. So, there are other drivers that drive people wanting to change and upgrade facades, like code compliance changes, for example, with ACP and fire performance. And some clients who just need to modernize in order to keep their buildings fresh and want to kind of keep their revenue up. But if you don't manage a facade, if you don't maintain a facade, there is an inevitability associated with its deterioration. And it's not something that we can escape. Materials will degrade and will fail, and the facade performs with it, of course.
Right, because we do experience that as well on like newly built buildings, right? Those which have been rushed. And I think, yes, it's a very critical issue in making sure that water and air, well, actually in the first place, airtightness is really underestimated in this region, because humidity is your biggest enemy at the moment, no? So in terms of, again, designing all of that and having heard about your background and the issue of material in a facade system, what do you think is the most critical problem or the most critical item in all of these materials, and what is actually the problem, other than what you've just said, that it's, silicone joints or gaskets will stop performing?
Well, look, Susanna, I have to say that you're the superior designer here, and I know that you know your way around, facade designs far better than I would. But over my career, I've been more of an evaluator than a designer. But I have probably evaluated, particularly when I was testing, well over 1,000 facades. I think when I left the testing industry, I was something like 1,200 facades that I've seen. And I think it's important to look at two significantly different types of facade. And I'll come on, again, if you'll indulge me, to explain why that's so important. So in the facade industry, again, as you know better than I do, Susanna, we really have two different types of a facade system. We have stick systems in the first place, and we have unitized systems in the second place. So let me just give you a kind of elevator pitch of what those are. So a stick system is where you build the framing onto the structure of the building, a bit like putting chopsticks on a building. And then you, when all of that frame is fixed, then you come along with your glass or your panels or whatever it might be. You fill in the gaps of your frames, and then you typically either you fix that on with some kind of mechanical fixing. Usually, what we call pressure plates, which are plates that kind of go over the panel edges, and so that's how the system goes together: framing, panels, and then fixing the whole thing on. So that's a stick system. And whereas a unitized system is fundamentally different. In a unitized system goes together rather like Lego blocks, the children's Lego blocks. So, but we build those blocks in a factory. So each unit has its own frame. Each unit has a piece of glass that sits in it, and all of the gaskets and sealants that go into it. And it's brought to site literally as a unit, and it's stacked. When it's, instead of building a frame on site, you literally stack them on top of each other, literally like Lego blocks. One of the main reasons that people do this is that usually the quality control is better in a factory. And so we can control quality better than on a site, working from a cradle in 45 degrees heat. And also it's very quick on site. So you can stock all your materials off site and then quickly bring them to site, build them. So there's a lot of advantages to a unitized system. There's a big however, though, and this is, again, part of one of the biggest things I want to say today. A unitized system, rather like Lego, it's very difficult to take an individual unit out if you need to. So if you've ever tried to build a Lego wall and then realized you've used the wrong color, or you need to put a little window in there, you can't take a piece out from the middle. You have to progressively take it down from the top again and then build it up again. And we have that problem now with unitized systems. And why is that a problem? Well, the problem is everything that we've said before. We're now at a stage where facades need refurbishing. And I should probably take a step back to say that a typical facade refurb lifespan is about 20 to 25 years. There's double glazing, for example, which is one of the things you mentioned earlier on, the glass going foggy, and double glazing will typically last about 20 years. Suppliers will give you a warranty for 5 years. If you're lucky, they'll give you a warranty for 10. If you pay them a lot of money, they'll give you a warranty for 15. But I've never seen a 20-year warranty on a facade, not for this part of the world anyway. And so that's the type of timescale that we're looking at for getting a facade to be needing refurbishment. And the problem, though, we've got plenty of buildings now in the Middle East that are that age. And just throw some numbers at you, if that helps to kind of people to understand, get a picture of it. We now have, in just Abu Dhabi and Dubai alone, about 200,000 buildings that are about 20 to 25 years old, just in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Forget, all of the other, notwithstanding all the others, Riyadh, Jeddah, Qatar, all of that kind of huge building that went on in West Bay in Qatar, all of the construction that's gone on in Riyadh and Jeddah. I'm not talking now about the NEOMs and the Red Sea developments. I'm talking about buildings that have been there now for 20 years. Kingdom Centre, Al Faisaliah Centre in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. All of those buildings now, or a lot of those buildings are 20 years old. We have literally got hundreds of thousands of buildings that are in that 20 to 25 year mark. Well, if you've built those with a unitized system, what do you do? How do you take that out? That's the issue. And if I might just kind of add, the big problem really is now that we've been congratulating ourselves for many years about, aren't we so good at kind of building unitized systems, and we've been doing it that way. But we now have no flexibility. One of the great things about a stick system is you can disassemble it in exactly the way that you assembled it. So if your glass fails after the 20 years that we expect it to fail at, you can actually take the pressure caps off. You can take the glass out. You can change all of the gaskets and all of the sealants, and you can then put new glass in, put new sealants on, probably even use the same pressure caps, and you've essentially got a refurbished facade, provided that nothing's serious has happened to your framing in that time. But you can't do that with unitized systems. A lot of unitized systems are actually what we call structurally sealed. So the glass is actually sealed in with a structural sealant. It's actually bonded in place. It's not fixed in place. So imagine if you've got a building that's, 50 stories tall, which we've got many of here. Definitely got loads of buildings that are 30 stories tall and above. I mean, again, if I could throw a number at you, I think it was years 7, 8, and 9, Dubai built more tall buildings, or certainly kept pace with the entire United States through some of those years. I think it was the Visual Capitalist as a source that kind of came up with that information. And you can go and check out some really interesting stat on their webpage. But the amount of building that we did was huge, and we used a lot of unitized facades. And now we don't have the flexibility to change them. In building in the preciseness and the precision and the quality and all of those things that are the right things to focus on, we've unfortunately built out some of the flexibility that we absolutely need.
Yeah. So with having lost the flexibility now in refurbishing unitized facades and thinking a little bit, to be future ready, future proofing building, basically. What do you think is like really the biggest issue now? So if our meant and for of these 200,000 buildings you have mentioned in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, how many of these would be built with unitized and how many of these would be built with stick? And then what would be the solution to it if there is that big problem of unitized versus stick, and what can I do with the unitized facade?
Well, look, the good news is that we have built some of our buildings with stick systems, but actually,
Some of them, yeah.
yeah, particularly since the kind of noughties, it's very rare to get a building with a stick system. They became unpopular because of the perceived advantages of the unitized system. And I have to say, it wasn't really until I've started to look back over my shoulder at what we've done, that I started to see this either. We all thought we were doing the right thing, incidentally. This isn't a criticism. We've all been caught by this. But we've really got two big issues. Firstly, like I say, we built a lot of unitized facade. And don't get me wrong, the 200,000 buildings that I kind of referred to, that information came from a census from Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And again, you can go look at that information online on the censuses, building census. But you have, some of those are tall buildings, but some of them are villas as well. But, people might say, yeah, but most of those are villas, right? And do you know what? Maybe half of them are villas. But you can't also ignore 100,000 villas either. So firstly, you've got a lot of unitized systems. Secondly, even if you don't have a lot of unitized systems, you have a lot of other buildings that are still going to need refurbs. But the biggest problem, again, and this is what I think we haven't really kind of joined up, and I'd like to try and join up, is this concept that the facade, unlike, for example, let's say you want to change the IT, you can. Let's say you want to change the furniture and the interior design, you can. Let's say you even want to change the MEP systems in the building, you can. All independently. But with a facade, you can't change a facade, not easily anyway, without affecting the entire rest of the building. And this isn't kind of pie in the sky thinking here. I'm literally working on buildings now where we're going to have to take all of the facade off from the top all the way to the bottom, and then do it again all the way to the top. And look, we're working with the client to try and understand how we manage this. But this particular building, just like many other buildings, is a mixed-use building. So it probably, it's got retail in it, it's got residence in it, it's got a little bit of hotel in it, it's got, but as soon as you take the facade off the building, then you expose the people. So people have to move out. You expose all of the interior finishes. So all of that's arguably ruined. Very, very difficult to cover that for, in some cases, up to 18 months while this happens. All your MEP, does that survive? Your IT, does that? No, that definitely doesn't survive. So it's the knock-on effects of facade refurbishments which are the biggest issue here. Your facade provides your protection. It protects you, the security, the environment, people. You simply can't take a facade off a building and expect everything in life to go on. So where do you put those people? If we have to refurbish 200,000 buildings, just like I say, just in those two cities alone, well, where do you put 200,000 buildings worth of people whilst 200,000 buildings have to be refurbished? You can imagine, once you start thinking about it in that kind of scale, it can be a societal problem. Are there enough homes for people? Are there enough offices for the businesses? It can have really knock-on effects on a societal level. So it's those two things that, Susanna, that are the issue. The fact that we have we have 20 to 30 years of buildings that all now are going to start putting their hand up and saying, no, I need medical attention. You've got a lot of those buildings that are unitized and therefore very difficult to refurbish flexibly. And you have it all happening in one go, So that's the issue that we need to deal with. And we haven't really been thinking about it, you see, because unlike other cities around the world, unlike other regions around the world, I don't know, North, South America, Europe, further east, a lot of their cities are much older. They're centuries old. So they've been in this refurb cycle. They've been managing this refurb cycle for centuries, literally. And in fact, if you look at some of the cities that I kind of occasionally go to, I was in Paris a few months ago. Most of the building work that they're doing, like the lion's share, 90% of the building work that they're doing is refurbs. Whereas here, 90% of what we're doing is new build and a small amount refurbs. And what we're gonna have to completely change our view onto is that dynamic has to change. So we need to start, firstly, making people aware of this issue that, hey, look, you're going to have to start looking over your shoulder. You don't start planning this, there's going to be an issue. And secondly, maybe stop kind of building the new stuff and start using what you have. It's an age-old, sustainability tenet, isn't it? Use what you have before you do something new. So again, that's where the nub of the problem is. And that's almost like collectively putting all of those pieces together, what the issue that we have in the GCC. We've got this unique situation where we don't have the experience for all these refurbs. We're going to have to do a lot of them. So we've got a lot of learning to do really quickly. And we're going to need a huge amount of resource to do it again. Imagine all the resources that we used in 30 years to build these buildings. Obviously, we don't need all of that again, but we're going to need a good deal of it again, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of people and materials, expertise.
Exactly, yeah, because this is what I feel is, I don't want to say missing, but maybe lacking in the region, because being from Germany, also in Germany, most of construction happening is refurbishment, but they have the support of the government, they have the knowledge built up over the years. They, obviously, as you said, they're much more matured markets, and they do have solutions in place when they're refurbishing like a high-rise tower. They have like a temporary facade, for example, put in place, but obviously different climate conditions, different magnitudes of buildings and towers which were built. So what do you think from a designer's perspective, from an evaluator's perspective, from developer's perspective, and then especially also from like the society and the entire industry? What do you think would be the solution to it? Or is there anything where you would want to emphasize on our audience what we should be doing moving forward?
Yes, that's again the second crux of this, isn't it? It's okay. It's all very well me saying, look, we've got this big problem coming, everybody, but the truth is, what do we try and do about it? Well, the reality is, I think that we're relatively new to the problem, and as a result, I would try and kind of point people in got to start looking at it in kind of about three or four ways. The first is, let's think about the chat. Hundreds of thousands of buildings, all about to move into that facade stage, refurb stage, kind of all at once, if you like. Well, the only thing we can do about that now is try and plan to whatever extent that we can, and assessing conditions. So, I've said they're all about to go. Once it won't be up to October the 1st, 2024 that everything needs doing then. But there'll be a progression, but there will be a significant progression over the next 5 to 10 years. It has to happen. As I mentioned earlier at the beginning, when we first started talking about this, age is inevitable. Materials will age, and so we have to start planning. So the first thing I would say is, owners or owners committees or developers, whoever's responsible for this, we need to start assessing condition and planning, and maybe even start building up budgets, maybe even start thinking about where resources would come from, and start to look at time scale and cost, because ultimately that's what it boils down to. One answer might have been knock the building down and do it again. That might have been an answer at some point in the past, but it really isn't anymore, is it? In an international stage, we can't really say, it's not a sustainable or an ethical thing to do now. We have to use what we have. And so again, particularly in that environment, we need to start planning. That's the first thing. That's if you like, answer to the first challenge. Now, yes, I suppose one might say that, but what about on a technological scale? So owners are not the experts on how to do this, really, from a technical perspective. So I would put the onus and responsibility to some extent, people, good designers like yourself, Susanna, people in the field like myself, but also in particular system designers. So the suppliers of facade systems, the installers of facade systems, the designers of facade systems, we need to start thinking about how we do this. Like I've said, a lot of these systems are structurally glazed. A lot of these unitized systems are structurally glazed. It's long been in the industry a no-no, i.e. it's not been an option to structurally glaze on site. It's been against the advice of all of the industry. Do not structurally glaze on site. Yes, when the occasional piece of glass goes, yes, but not when you have to do 50,000 pieces of glass. It's just not a realistic proposition to structurally glaze on site. So we need to start thinking about different ways of doing that. I'm working on a building at the moment where what we're considering is a cassette system. So yes, we cut out the old glass, and yes, we tidy it up a little bit, but then the new piece of glass doesn't go in and get structurally sealed in. It goes in a frame, in a smaller frame that sits in and then is mechanically fixed. And that can be done, again, it's prepared off-site, brought onto site, fixed on site. It then becomes a panelized system rather than a unitized system. We're almost like converting the unitized system into a panelized system. So we need to start doing that. We need to start developing the experience. We really need the help of contractors. I've long been of the belief, of the position, Susanna, that our expertise is with our contractors. We call ourselves consultants, and we have a responsibility to the client to design and push the boundaries and all that kind of stuff. But the contractors is where a lot of the expertise is. The system suppliers is where a lot of the expertise is, and we need them to start coming to the party to help us with this. The next thing is, what do we do in the future? So, Susanna, if you and me are designing a building for, I don't know, let's say the Red Sea coast on Saudi, we need to start thinking less, to some extent, about what we're doing now and how it will work now, but also we need to start thinking about what we'll do in 25 years' time when it needs to be taken apart. We need to start building for flexibility. Someone asked me in a conference a little while ago, what will be the shape of facades in the future? And they said in about, let's say, 50 years. And I can remember 50 years back, but I tell you what, I couldn't have thought about is if I remember 50 years back, what I thought about what was happening now, couldn't have imagined the internet. I couldn't have imagined mobile phones. I couldn't have imagined all, drones and all of those kind of things. The only thing I can promise you about 50 years from now, if God willing we're all here in 50 years now, is that things will be different and we can't conceptualize what there will be in 50 years. Therefore, the best strategy would be to design for flexibility, design for changeability, design buildings that can be changed for that amazing kind of world-saving device that we start to build onto our facades to save the planet. It sounds like an out of this world thing to say, but that is the way we are going, and that's what we need to start thinking about doing. Instead of thinking about now in the next 5 years, we need to start thinking about 25 years' time, and really, keeping that in the forefront of our minds. Think about what we don't know. And the last thing I would say, in this context, is to answer the question, I suppose, when. Now is the answer. We've got to start doing this now. The longer we procrastinate about it, the longer we prevaricate over whether I'm kind of right about this or right about that, and other people. And it's not just me that's saying this in the industry, by the way. It's plenty of people across many kind of great think tanks are really kind of focusing on this now. We've got to start thinking about it now. If we don't start thinking about it now, the wave will break over our shoulders before we've even turned around. And so this is kind of the situation. So yeah, it's a big challenge. And there are some big challenges there. And if we don't start talking about the challenge, planning for the challenge, preparing for the challenge, and not making the challenge worse in the next 10 to 20, 30 years, if we don't start doing that, I think we're going to have a problem. But we've got to start. That's my message. Let's start thinking about these issues.
Thank you so much, Andy, for those insights. And yes, the sooner we start, the better, because your point in saying that, there will be an issue and in 50 years, we can't even predict what's going to happen, or we can predict it or we can assume, but we won't be able to predict how our buildings are reacting to that, right? And another statement of what you said is like to start now, or to start that awareness and to educate the people about the importance of it, because we all know, how many times are we spending indoors, how much fossil fuels are we burning in cooling and heating our buildings, right? So it will become, I think, a pretty big issue. And it is already an issue, but it was becoming bigger and bigger if we don't start now.
Look, thanks very much for allowing me the platform. It's been a pleasure talking to you, as always, Susanna. And I'm looking to you now to save the world.
Thank you very much, Andy, for being our guest, for raising the awareness, and for once again setting, the standards and being like the pioneer in the Middle East and doing a change to our audience. Thank you so much for listening in all the way through. If you have like any comments for us on today's episode, it would be great to hear from you. We would love to have you tuned in to our next episode, and stay tuned for the next topic.